Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of my epistemological musings. Um, so today, I'd just like to carry on from where I left off yesterday on that whole issue of science and religion and reality and the connection between all of these things. And it turns out that the main sort of fulcrum that all of this turns on is really the question of truth statements and how we deal with truth statements. And of course, this is a very pertinent issue now because it is such a contentious subject where people are trying to colonize the whole concept of truth and appropriate it for various purposes. And so it's really useful to just take a step back and just to think about what that word means, what the concept of truth really actually means, and what it entails. And the main thing, the main takeaway that I'd like to end up with at the end of all of this is just the whole notion that truth concepts are more complicated than they would appear. And this is sort of a rough rendition of a statement by Bertrand Russell in his paper on denoting, where he was talking about denotation being rather more difficult than it would seem at first. And truth statements are similar; they're in a similar category. And it turns out that really it is a matter of denoting. The problem with truth in general is really a question of what statements actually denote, and by denotation, what's meant is what's marked in the world by a statement, and truth statements in and of themselves are not that problematic. It's only when one considers them as denoting things in the real world that they become intensely problematic and more than just that, unsolvable, really. And so to get a flavor for why that might be the case, and why we don't really have an issue with truth statements in everyday informal language. In everyday informal language, truth statements are not difficult at all. And that's mostly because truth is a value that's assigned by language to things. But very often, what happens, especially in formal settings, is that there's a I want to say an inversion, but there's a replacement that happens where that informal notion of language assigning truth values to things gets replaced by the formal notion of things having truth values, and that statements becomes things in themselves, and that those statements inherently have truth values, and this replacement of one concept with another really is at the root of a lot of I want to say political, journalistic, and sort of marketing practices that one has to be, and this is why I say one has to treat with caution. When that sort of legalistic concept of truth and how we deal with truth in that sense gets surreptitiously replaced by an informal one, backwards and forwards, we really have to watch out and be very careful with what these things actually mean. So just to get back to that whole thing of truth, I'm going to be using a sort of a bit from an MIT lecture by Eric Demain, which I'll link in the description. But essentially, it's a good way of just getting a very initial sort of grasp of just where the issue lies roughly, and so it basically comes down to this relationship between programs and decision problems. And a good way to think about this is I'm going to use Timmy's apples. Timmy likes apples, right? So we can make this statement, and in usual informal everyday language, that's not a difficult thing to understand. And if we want to know if that's true or false, we can go to Timmy and ask him, well, is it true? Do you like apples? But if we want to use that sort of thing in a formal sense, we have to turn that into a program. And by program here, what I mean is that it has to be something where we can input in something about the world and get an output that matches that statement correctly. So, for example, when Timmy likes apples, we want something where we can put an object into our program, and it will output if this thing is an apple, then if the statement Timmy likes apples is true, then the output should also be true. And if it's false, well, then we don't know what the output is. But that's a bit of an issue when we're dealing with programs. We want the output to be either true or false. So we can replace it with something that's similar, not quite equivalent, but similar, where we can say, okay, if this thing is an apple, then we know that Timmy would like it. If our statement about Timmy liking apples is true in the first place, then then the statement we know that Timmy likes this thing is going to be true. And if it's not an apple, then we know that Timmy likes this thing is false. So it's not necessarily the case that Timmy doesn't like it. It's just that we don't know whether Timmy likes it or not. So we can already see that when we transferring the sort of informal statement about Timmy liking apples, which is perfectly understandable and easily passable, into something formal and rigorous, it already becomes less handy. It's sort of like it's a bit of a mess. It's sort of like there's all kinds of kind of conditions that we have to take into consideration and take care of. So this is okay. It's difficult, but it's okay. We can deal with it. And in most cases, we can sort of reduce that down to something that's manageable at least. And essentially, when you're programming a computer, and I'm going to say when you're actually actively programming a computer, because it turns out that there's other ways to go about this. But when you're programming a computer, it has to be tractable in that sort of way. You have to be able to think through the steps of the thing. But what's missing here and what's hiding in the wings is this whole decision problem. The decision problem of whether this thing that we're looking at in the first place is an apple. And that hides most of the problems that we run into with something like this, because it's not just a case of it being something where objects in the real world are either apples or not apples. That's simple enough to get one's head around. I mean, for fruit. That's simple enough. We can try and come up with a definition for apples. Say it needs to be roughly round, it needs to be edible, it needs to come from a particular sort of tree, and already when you start making those sorts of definitions, you can already see that it already is starting to get a bit dodgy. It's again, it turns out to be more complicated than one might initially think to make such a specification. But that's fine. But then we have to deal with other sorts of things like, well, why is it that we would call a Macintosh computer an apple? And how should we relate that to Timmy's opinion about apples? What did Timmy actually mean? Did he mean Apple computers or apples? So we need to know something more about Timmy before we can actually even start to get to grips with this issue. So that's one side of the issue. Another side of the issue might be things that functionally and might look the same as an apple, but might come from the planet Zarkon. So you might have a Zarkonese apple. Is this an apple? Does it need to say it tastes exactly like an apple and Timmy can eat it and everything? And as far as Timmy's concerned, he doesn't know where it's coming from. So as far as he knows, it's an apple. If we were to then go to tell him that actually this isn't an apple from an earth tree, actually this comes from the planet Zarkon, and say Timmy has some really nasty opinions about the things that come from the planet Zarkon. Really, he's a bit of a bigot in that regard. And so he says, no, I don't like this. So is this thing that comes from the planet Zarkon still an apple? How does that affect our truth claim about apples? And that might seem like a rather odd example, but we can replace, say, a place on Earth for something like that, where we really have to consider a whole bunch of conditions that might attach to something like that. And then we can get into even murkier water, where we might have to think about concepts themselves. Because the more we think about it, the more it becomes apparent that even something like an apple isn't really something in the world. So our truth statement about this is an apple isn't really something in the world. It's a statement we make about things we observe in the world, and so it's a label again that we attach to things. It's not the truth. The truth of the statement, this is an apple, isn't the property of apples. It's a statement of our opinions and our ideas about apples, and that realization is incredibly important because now we have to start just to think, well, we have to go through every single concept and decide whether that concept is an apple, and whether that concept then satisfies our program that we had to assign a truth value to the statement Timmy likes apples. So it becomes a problem within a problem within a problem. So you have to go, is the number 0 an apple? Is the number 1 an apple? What about the number pi? Is the number pi an apple? And so the more we consider these sort of things, the more we realize that our common sense notion of truth becomes more difficult the more rigorous we want to be with it. So it's fine when we want to use it informally and we want to just say things off the cuff. And when we understand it as just being something that is of language, it's in order to speak of things, we need to make truth assignments of things. But when we start wanting to use it formally, and this is now when we use it in the legalistic sense, or in the sense of, and often the legalistic sense bleeds over into marketing and law. Law I already said, marketing and politics and journalism, and because all of these things sort of are governed in a way by legalistic principles. I mentioned yesterday the whole idea of accountability, and how accountability is an incredibly important aspect of all of these issues. Your approach to truth claims should really be a function of the accountability that attaches to it. And the accountability turns out to be a legalistic question. And to the extent that law tries to make a lot of these questions of truth rigorous, we find that the more we try to make the assignment of truth values rigorous, the more it escapes from us. It runs away. And that is in fact something that can be made rigorous. We can make that notion that truth and denotation is undefinable. We can make that notion rigorous, and it has been made rigorous. So the notion of truth itself and whether something is true or false cannot be made rigorous, and we can know that rigorously. And so as a general life principle, that's just a kind of a useful thing to think about. Whenever you come across truth statements in marketing or journalism or politics, is just to think about it in that sort of way, that the truth of the matter is something that is assigned, not a property of the things that are being spoken about. I think I'll just leave it there. I think that's probably about long enough for a video, and I'll see if I can make another one tomorrow. Okay. Bye.